My name is Dom Price from Atlassian, and I'm Atlassian's word futurist. But at Experts Unleashed, I want to do something different with you. I want to bring experts from their field to you. Experts that aren't going to talk about thought leadership or theory, but they're going to bring their lived experience, their pragmatic insights, and their stories to help you unleash your potential. So the format of this show is incredibly simple. It's all based on three things. Every single session we do with an expert and Experts Unleashed, we're going to have three chapters, three core things that they are famous for, where we go through the theory, we go through the practice, and we get them to share one insight that you can try. So listen in for the three chapters. Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Experts Unleashed. For those that haven't seen Experts Unleashed yet, this is a show where we take thought leadership and we politely throw it out the window because there is no room for it in 2024. Episode 1 saw us bring Ben Crow to the stage. Ben, a phenomenal mindset coach with Ash Barty, ex-world #1 tennis player, shared with us about human being versus human doing and how you can train your mindset to be an elite professional, an elite human, and the best version of yourself. Now, for episode 2, I'm looking around the world and everyone's talking about AI, machine learning, cybernetics. I still don't know what that is. I Googled it twice last night. Large language models, metaverse. And I was like, who can we find who can take all that stuff and turn it into common, logical, accessible sense for us? Now, when we went through the Rolodex, there was only one name on there, and the name was Professor Genevieve Bell. Now, I had the pleasure, I've met Genevieve numerous times. Recently, we're on stage together. Genevieve went before me at an event. There was about, 6,000-7,000 people in the audience listening to Genevieve tell amazing stories. I had the misfortune of following Genevieve. Someone afterwards did make the very apt comment. They were like, she was amazing, so informative, so intelligent. Dom, you were quite funny. And so I now know my place in the world. Genevieve, if you've not met her before, technology's first kind of fortune teller, kind of a futurist, doesn't like the word, we'll unpack that later. Educated at Stanford, where she studied cultural anthropologist. We need to work out what that is. Did 20 years with Intel. There's a fascinating story about drinks and bars and how she got that job despite not wanting the job, and is now the Australian National University Vice-Chancellor and President, essentially CEO for those that don't understand what that means. And Woman in Tech Hall of Fame. There is a long list of accolades for Genevieve. We can cover those separately, or just look her up online. But let's crack on and meet Genevieve. Genevieve, thanks for joining us this morning.
Oh my God, Dom, that's such a lot to process first thing in the morning because I'm in Australia where it is still first thing in the morning.
It's still first thing in the morning here. I'm back in Oz. I was in the US last week, but I'm back here. I'm this energetic off chai tea. This is what happens on a Thursday morning.
That's terrifying as to what an Expert Unleashed looks like. I need coffee. You've got tea. We're both somewhere in Australia, but it is morning.
We are doomed. So Genevieve, one of the things we've done your intro. One of the things we always start with when we do sessions at Atlassian is this exercise called My User Manual. We start with it because when you buy a TV, it comes with a user manual. In fact, you buy anything and it comes with a user manual, and you hire a human. No user manual, right? Nothing,
yeah,
right?
Also, Dom, when was the last time you ever cracked a user manual for something you bought? Aren't you just one of the ones that just plug it in and see what happens?
This is how you work out relationships. And my now wife is the one that just plugs stuff in, gets upset when it doesn't work. I'm the one that I read at least the first page to get like a rough directional guide. Then I just start playing with stuff.
Yeah, and you see, I'm the person who keeps the user manuals in a binder, tabbed by the product, which is terrifying.
But also makes a lot of sense judging by your background. So that is not a surprise.
It might suggest I have a classificatory orientation.
That's a very detailed approach to life. Genevieve, if we were to unpack your My User Manual, I know when we shared with you beforehand, the thing we're going to talk about was values. One of the area of My User Manual is like, what are my values of how I turn up in work? If you were to try and share with our audience, how you think about your values of who Genevieve Bell is and how you turn up, how would you explain that?
Oh, relatively straightforward. I was raised to believe that your life should be in service, so that you should spend your time, your energy, your intellect, your passion, your resources to ensure that the world was a better place, and that it was better not just for you, but for all the people that wouldn't get into the rooms where better was being negotiated. So service, number one.
Yeah. Hang on, where did that come from?
My mom. Okay. She sat me down when I was little and said you had a moral obligation to make the world a better place.
I love that. Okay.
Yeah, me too. A straightforward, simple, sometimes deeply overwhelming, but a really good North
Oh,
Star.
hugely overwhelming,
Yep.
and you'll never achieve it. Like
No,
it almost
absolutely
feels
not.
unachievable. But yeah,
But a good, I've always found it a really good decision-making tool, because you can ask yourself, will this job, will this project, will this thing I'm doing help make the world a better place? And sometimes you do them even if it doesn't, but for the most part, it's a good calculus.
I suppose it's almost a good way of checking the flip. Like, am I inadvertently doing something that's wholly selfish? That's like just for me and not for others. Yeah, I like that.
And then, you have to be able to sort of say to yourself, what does better mean, right? And then for me, better then is about things like, are the things you're doing helping the world be more fair, more just, equitable, sustainable? These days, I'd add hopeful to the list, because I think the other thing about how I know I want to turn up, and I don't always manage it, is having spent 30 years in the US, coming home to Australia, there's something about the way Australians do cynicism, which is it's quite spectacular. We have a really kind of dry kind of note that Australians adopt. And while I recognize why we do that and how we do that, I keep thinking it's easy to be cynical and it's harder to be hopeful. And I want to work out how to keep being hopeful. So I hope one of my values is that I can turn up finding a through line, right? A hopeful through line. And then I guess
I would agree with that. Having met you a few times, I think you always, even when you share the rounded stories, right? Because hope isn't like always positive, happy, clappy, right? It's a rounded story, but here's what we can do about it. It's future looking.
Yeah. So service, hope, and look, the other one, which would be in every user manual that was ever circulated ahead of me, I think, is Genevieve likes to work. And I think there's a little bit about, I'm sure I've been accused, not celebrated, accused of being a workaholic. People would ask me, do I have a good work-life balance? I've never quite understood how that question is on a seesaw. But look, I value hard work and I like it. I find it rewarding. So I'm a hard worker that way. But that also means I probably, I have a lot of books because I like to read. I've done a lot of things because I like to do things. I am sort of relentlessly pursuing intellectual questions and things. So hard work.
Yeah, you're deeply curious as well. I would have put deeply curious in there, like your hunger to. I suppose that meets all three. Well, thank you for sharing a little bit about you, Genevieve, so the audience now gets to know more about you. I agree with all of those. I've met you enough times yet. They sound consistent and congruent with the Genevieve I've met. So you've passed the AI test. You are not a bot.
Good. But then, Dom, we do need to say the other one, which you probably also know, is that I think the other thing people would increasingly say about me is that I'm prone to be a little bit silly. So you would have said funny, silly, but there's a little bit, just a small hint that runs through all of that of not entirely serious all the time.
I would have said mischievous. There's a deep grain of mischief in there, but that's our little secret. That's no one else needs to know about that.
Tell no one that, Dom.
No one that. So Genevieve, the format of Experts Unleashed is we cover three chapters with our experts. We agree those three chapters in advance, right? So no surprise, no secret to anyone. The three we've agreed for you, I'm particularly excited by, given where we're at in 2024 and the noise I'm experiencing around some of the words that we're going to cover today that you'll make sense of because you're good at that. Chapter one's going to be on technical systems, like understanding what do we mean by whenever we say AI and machine learning and all these words that get interchange that aren't interchangeable. Lessons from the past, which I'm really excited to get to. I know from your history and cultural anthropology and studying First Nations, you've got a huge grounding and anchoring in how we understand from the past. And then flipping that, chapter 3, how we use that to form a blueprint of the future. I couldn't think of a better narrative for someone like you in a time like this to start with. So technical systems. When we hear all these words, and AI is the one being bandied around every 7 minutes right now, if you're lucky, it comes with a lot of nervousness, and it comes with just as much sort of excitement. Maybe right now more nervousness than excitement. How should our audience, like this group of business leaders, go about understanding technical systems? What do we need to know right now to be equipped?
Oh, such a good set of questions, Dom. Look, let's take AI, because I think that's a useful place to start. Because as you say, it is a phrase that, were we to go look up the Google, how many times has the word turned up? It would have been, it was sort of off the chart activity, right? And I think there's a couple of really important ways we need to unpack that phrase. First is to unpack it by saying, actually, you can't point at a thing. You can't pick up the thing and say, oh, it's AI, or the thing, she says, pulling all the random stuff on my desktop. Pen, lipstick, we know what those other things. There's also a jar of honey on my desktop, I've just realized, and I'm not quite sure why.
Just in case.
Just in case. AI isn't a thing in that sense, right? There isn't a single thing you can point to and say that's AI. AI is, in fact, a constellation of things. It's a constellation of technologies, if you want to think about it that way. And we can unpack it through that. We could say, look, AI requires, to make it work, an algorithm of some sort, so a piece of computational logic. It probably requires some kind of data to have trained that computational logic and the machine learning that sits on top of that, right? So it may require those things, which means it also probably needs a server farm and a computational network and a comms network. It needs electricity. It will need a problem statement that it's solving. There's all these kind of pieces to it, right? And you can think about it in the version of the world you and I grew up in the sort of Silicon Valley tech stack, right? Bottom of the stack is all the foundational stuff. You need computing, you need CPUs and GPUs, you need a server farm, you need telecommunications, because it turns out all that AI stuff has to run around somewhere, and it's running around on, cables and in zeros and ones. You're also then going to need a series of compute technologies, both to create and then run these systems. You'll need data to prime all of it, which will have to have been collected somewhere. And then you'll need a set of ways to access that. And that kind of formulation, that stack, a UI, UX, a set of programs that are underneath of it, a set of workloads, if we want to call them that, and computation. That's a lot to explain to anyone. It is much easier to just say AI.
Yeah. We group it together and just hope you understand where in the stack you are.
Group it together, right? And unpacking all of that, for me, as soon as you start to say, look, AI is actually a constellation of all this stuff, as soon as you unpack all that stuff, you start to go, uh-oh. If it's all those things, having a point of view about it or needing to build it or worry about regulating it means actually having to think about all the bits and pieces.
Because they're all interconnected, right? Like if you go to the lowest point, the foundational layer on that stack, like the compute power and the energy required.
Absolutely. And so, all the things we don't talk about, right? When we talk about AI, we talk a lot about how it's going to make things more efficient. We often don't talk about what the costing of it will be, both in terms of electricity, water for cooling server farms, networks for running the stuff around. Because, for you and I sitting, I assume you're in Sydney and I'm here in Canberra. If we're accessing certain sorts of programs at the moment, so what some people call workloads, so a routinized task that's happening. Frequently, if you're on your laptop, it's going all the way to America to serve you an answer and come all the way back. And so AI is also not in a single place in that sense. So again, not an easy thing to point to. So one way of thinking about it is that whole constellation of stuff, which means, as you rightly point out, there's all sorts of interdependencies. If you change the configuration of a network, things move through it differently. If you change the affordances of a server farm, different things can happen in it. If you upgrade tech, things will move faster or move more slowly or move differently. If you change the programming selection, different things will happen. If you change the user interface and what's required of it, other things. So all of it works together and apart, which of course also means how we think about building capacity, how we think about jobs, hugely difficult.
And how we think about trust, right? Because I think there's a nice simplicity right now of going, I don't trust the AI, as it gets called. But what we're saying is we're not trusting the thing that's surfaced to us without understanding the multiple layers of where that could have gone right or wrong.
And not only, is it not singular, which I always think is also really interesting. People go AI, and I'm like, okay, you do realize it's AIs, but I also know that just sounds terrible, Australian accent or yours. It doesn't work. But the reality is that constellation of technologies manifests itself really differently if you're using the AI that sits inside WhatsApp or Instagram or Amazon, or Atlassian. It's a different constellation of the pieces, right? And even if it's you or, anything I pulled up in my phone this morning, it may have some of the same pieces, but the configurations are different. The underlying bits are different. In order for me to use the AI on my phone, I'm interacting with about half a dozen different organizations and companies and systems that are kind of hiding underneath.
Yes.
And so that piece of it is important for me. I think the piece you've just said about the way people imagine it is also hugely important in any conversation about AI. You and I are of an age, I'm slightly older than you, but AI has been brought to us in the movies forever.
Yeah,
The idea
it's
that
been part of science fiction for us growing up, right? It was mythical.
Well, but also fully formed, right? So mythical in the sense that it could only happen on the movie screen, but fully formed in that sense that, we knew that the AI was going to kill John Connor.
Well, and I think, is that the thing? Is it that our frame of reference, like when it's, if you're a middle-aged person in business right now, the reason you're nervous about AI is because you saw it in the movies, and to sell tickets, those movies genuinely ended up with someone being killed. And so our frame of reference is, well, the AI came along and it ruined Terminator 3. So therefore it's going to ruin me in 2024.
Look, I think that's not such a long bow to draw, right? On the one hand, it sounds really silly when you say it out loud, but the reality is, for actually more than 200 years, at least in the Western traditions, we've told stories about things being brought to life by technology, and that all going horribly wrong. So I think the Frankenstein story and everything forward. And then, of course, before that story, we have all the Golem stories, and we have a whole lot of other stories that pervade our, and here is the technical term, wait for it, our sociotechnical imagination. Which I know you do have one of those, but what it effectively means is the way we think about things is framed both by what they do and how we imagine them, right? And so, of course, when we approach an AI, we're bringing what we know about it in a technical sense, but also, in our instance, generations of narratives about what happens when technology looks a bit like humans and behaves a bit like humans.
Yeah. I imagine there's a bit of self-preservation in there as well, right? It's like we immediately fear the unknown. You used the word hope before. I think a lot of people see the unknown and panic and shrink.
Well, and I don't think it's all unknown, right, Tom? And if you look at the history, again, in the West of the Industrial Revolution, of 250 years of new technologies, right? Each one of those profound technological breakthroughs. So think, mechanization, steam engines, electricity, telegraphy, television, indeed the internet, maybe AI, I think AI. Each one of those technological transformations has also profoundly restructured society. And there have been people who weren't in a winning position at the end and people who were, and rearrangements of, I tend to think of people, rearrangements of bodies and power and nation states and economies. And so when we say we're fearful of technology, I never think of that as being irrational. I think of that as saying, well, look, we've got 250 years that says when something really is a game changer, our lives will be different as a result of it. And not everyone's going to end up in the as well as they started, right? And so that fear doesn't feel irrational. But I suspect for our age cohort, and maybe for some others, part of the ambivalences that got surfaced when ChatGPT launched in the last sort of 20-month cycle is that it was the first time anything had felt like the movies in absolutely ages. And it had that bit where you're like, I remember this. And the answer was, you're right, it didn't go well for us. And so
I think there's a fascinating moment, like if I'm just like wholly selfish for a minute, the fascinating experience for me was up until that point, a lot of the chat around AI and all the other words that spring to mind was being driven by the McKinseys and stuff of this world saying it's going to generate $1 trillion gazillion and it's going to save you a right. And so whenever I hear that stuff, I'm like, oh, cute, thought leadership from a Big Four consulting. And I ignore it. And that ignorance was okay because every time someone showed me something, it was really bad. So I was like, oh, not only are you making BS statements, but when I see the end product, it's not real. But I wasn't seeing the evolution. So I think for me, when ChatGPT came out, I'm like, no, it won't work because the other incarnations haven't worked. And then it did work. It was that, oh, bugger moment. Like now we're in that reordering thing that you talked about. It's not a technological change that's a +1 or a -1. It's a redistribution of how we think about work.
And part of the magic of ChatGPT as an instantiation of generative AI, right? Because there were others, but part of what ChatGPT in particular did really well was the UX and the user interface, right? And they took advantage of 20 plus years of thinking in that space. So you will remember the days before Google.
I do. I had every internet browser in the world and some very weirdly named ones.
Ask Jeeves, Alta Vista, Mosaic, Yahoo. There were a whole collection of them. If for those of you who are thinking, what the hell is that woman on about? There was a period of time when you logged onto the internet, you were confronted with a portal that was like some kind of demented internet mall of just like lists and lists. And it was, you had to...
It's chaos.
Yeah, it was you had to push through things to find a way to find things. And it was it felt very chaotic, and it also didn't feel like for a user you could navigate it easily. And when Google came along, part of the transformation in user interface work that Google did, Marissa Mayer and others, was they got rid of everything. White screen, single box, you in
One-to-one
control,
relationship.
one-to-one relationship. And, there was a lot of work that had to go in the background to make that true. But it made very clear what the relational thing was, and it trained us to have that sense of us talking to the machine, right, in a deep background sense.
What gave us comfort, Genevieve? It gave the layman a level of comfort. I just talk to the box, and the box talks back, and the box is often right. I don't actually care what's behind the box.
I don't think about it. And then, sort of a little more than a decade later, when Apple was launching all of its first touchscreen-based products, and its iPad in particular, one of the challenges they had was working out how to surface information, how to wake the machine up quickly and how to surface information quickly. And so building in a little bit of a time delay so that you knew the machine was doing something but you weren't impatient is how the ... evolved. So think about when you've got that little sort of which you know to think the machine is thinking is happening. Excellent. And so you take those two things and combine them, and you suddenly realize in some ways the exquisite advances in the ChatGPT interface, right? Because it's you talking to the machine, and you can see the machine is thinking as it talks back to you, and it types out at almost the speed you can read it. So there's a very so while there is an enormous amount of hardwired computational activity going on one end, there's also a lot of really clever UI going on the front end to make it feel something. So not just be something, but feel something. So those two bits about AI, right? So it's a list of things. Also, it's a feeling and a set of relationships that are motivated by a whole lot of stories we've told about what it would be.
Yeah. So I want to go back to that, right? Those you talked about the thing that kind of grabbed my attention there is when you talk about the reordering of the system, right? You got those milestone moments in the last 150 years. I don't know if anyone was particularly great at second guessing the impact, but what we can say after the event was there definitely was an impact and a reordering of how we think about stuff. How can we use that if we drop into chapter 2, right? And I know from your background in cultural anthropology and just your general curiosity and your work with First Nations people around the world, you've got a genuine interest in understanding lessons from the past, not in a morbid way, right? Not in a FBI investigator type way, but in a how can we learn from it to do things different. If you think about where we are now, what are the prevalent lessons from the past that we should be tapping into so we go, oh, cool, we're not going in eyes wide shut here. We've got some lived experience.
Yeah. Well, of course, first of all, I have to smack you on the nose and say, Dom, First Nations people aren't in the past; they're in our presence and in our futures too. So there is a little bit there about no.
You're right. I'll take that. I deserve that one. Yeah.
Thank you. But I am really, and we should have started by saying where we were. Right. I'm on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people here in Canberra, and it means a lot to me that I get to work in a place that's been continuously occupied for 12,000 years. Right? And
let's address that. Yeah, I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and as someone who is called Australia home for 21 years, I think it's an absolute privilege to be able to share the land with those people. Thank you.
Yeah, me too. And that bit about remembering where we start, everything's hugely important, and the responsibilities that come with it. Look, if you think and so sort of I then sort of say to myself, what are the pieces? Let's just stick with AI, right? Because I think that's a good place to be. What are the bits of the AI story that are older? So we talked a little bit about some of the ones of the sort of the literary stories. So Frankenstein, and yes, I am calling James Cameron literary. So Frankenstein and also the Terminator.
He's been called worse.
He has, and clearly, Blade Runner and that narrative for me, at least that's always my touchstone movie. AI doesn't just live in the movies though, right? And it's actually really important to go back and work out where that phrase starts, because its starting point is hugely important to how it turns up, right? So the phrase AI is coined, so someone invents it basically in a grant proposal in 1955 for a conference that would happen in 1956. And they write in their grant proposal, it's going to test me. They write in their grant proposal, the study is to proceed on the basis of the conjecture that every aspect of learning or intelligence can be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. break that down, right? Any aspect of learning or intelligence can be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. So the conceit in the 1950s was that you could break down the way we speak, the way we think, the way we learn, the way we reason into small incremental pieces. And each one of those pieces could be effectively simulated or automated by a machine.
And therefore repeatable.
And therefore repeatable. And therefore, that would be it.
Can we just pause for a moment? I'm petrified at that statement in 2024, but that was the 1950s.
That's 1956. And then you have to ask yourself, what the hell? Like, what were they doing in 1956 that they thought that's what they should be banging on about, and why is that their phrase, right? So what you then need to ask yourself is, and this is partly why history always matters to me, right? I think it's always really important to ask yourself, where does the phrase come from? Like, what's its history and what's hiding inside of it, right? So I got really interested in AI, and I was like, where the hell does this come from? So sure enough, 1956. And the group of people in 1956 who are writing that grant proposal are really important, right? There's 4 names on the grant proposal. Marvin Minsky, John McCarthy, Claude Shannon, and Nathaniel Rochester. Some of those names will be familiar to us, right? Claude Shannon was the outgoing CTO at Bell Labs in 1955. So Bell Labs was probably the most important R&D shop in America in the mid-1950s. They were working out how to change telecommunications networks. They were building early computers. Claude Shannon was a flat-out just genius and a really interesting cat in all kinds of ways. There's some great bios of him. If you're looking for something to go read any bio about Claude Shannon. He's amazing. A
relative by any chance?
No, but he did build a telegraph system on his mum's back fence, and I kind of love him for that too. But he's from, but for your boy Mark, I reckon he might be from Michigan. So Claude Shannon. Nathaniel Rochester was a software and engineering designer, so a hardware designer basically at IBM, and was the main architect of IBM's, at that point, most recent mainframe. So he had built and been responsible for leading the team that built the most sophisticated computer in America at that point. And remember, IBM in the 1950s, along with Honeywell, are kind of the people producing every major mainframe. And those mainframes are, by the 1950s, through American companies and in American R&D labs, so in places like, all the big national labs, so Los Alamos and Sandia, but also in government departments and also in companies, and starting to do a lot of things, right? So computation. Minsky and McCarthy are recently minted PhDs. They're younger. They will go on, respectively, to be the first professors of effectively computing and robotics at MIT and Stanford. McCarthy will establish the department along with others at Stanford. Minsky will go to MIT and be part of the Media Lab and other things. In 1955, 1956, it's the industry guys that are the big names, and the postdocs are postdocs. And why does industry want to collaborate with a bunch of postdocs for a conference at Dartmouth in 1956? What else is in that stew, right? What else is prompting all of that? Now, of course, for McCarthy and Minsky, they're respectively working on things like neural networks. So they're some of the first authors of neural network technology papers. They're thinking about the future of computing. McCarthy spent time with Turing. So they're they've got
good company.
They've got good pedigrees. But, in the 50s, computers were kind of hard to come by, and they were still big and clunky. But for Shannon and Rochester, they're really interested in where computing is going, right? And they're interested in it from we work in companies that are building them but also selling them, so they have a market-based interest. Minsky and McCarthy clearly have an intellectual interest. But you also need to think back, okay, 1955, what else is going on then? Well, in 1955, it's also a heightened period of awareness in the United States about Russia. It's the Cold War period. There is a lot of anxiety and existential reasoning about the threat of the world. And one of the other players in this whole conversation is the United States Defense Department, who are really interested in, if computing can be made to simulate every aspect of learning and reasoning, will it be a weapon? Or can it help us defeat weapons? And if so, how do we accelerate that? So they're at the table too, right? They bring money to the table. And part of what's making all of them think this is possible, right? Because not only do they then go on to say, study is to proceed on the aspect of blah, 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 convective, blah, blah, blah. You know, every aspect of learning can so be, the machine can be made to simulate it. The second sentence in this chart also then talks about all the things they're going to simulate. So human speech, the ability to recognize symbols and abstract concepts, a capacity to learn for itself and to do tasks currently reserved for humans, which is a lovely sop that covers many other things. But they're clearly interested in the 1950s about, could you teach a machine to understand human speech and make sense of it? Could you teach a machine to understand strategic reasoning and also to see the world and be able to read it, not quite so literally, and then iteratively learn and do things reserved for humans? And they say, and we'll get that done in the next decade. Done and dusted.
Okay.
Yeah, and you're like, maybe not. It's like, seems ambitious. But the reason they can have that ambition is if you roll the clock back 10 more years, back to 1946, right? Computers on the planet were the size of the room I'm in. They were like multiple shipping containers big. So it's the ENIAC, right, in Philadelphia, that takes the power of 5 suburbs in Philadelphia to work, that does addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. And, you know, you can smell it because it burns all of the pieces, and it, you know, it's like, it was just this, and you made a huge racket. And they used to joke in Philly, apparently, that you could tell they were computing up at the base because the lights would flicker in your house because it was such an energy draw, right?
Yeah.
And it didn't do very much.
They're looking back 10 years and going, here's the rate of change in 10 years. If I go forward 10 of that same rate and then 10 more, so that, okay.
Ding, 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 ding. So they're looking at it and going, if we can go from a thing that, you know, does 4 sets of calculations, we have to rearrange it in between them, and it's the, you know, the size of 2 shipping containers and requires the power of, you know, 6 suburbs, to a thing that's now the size of my desk, taller than me, but my desk. 10 more years, where are we going to be? And so they're imagining that this sort of rate of change and rate of adaptation is going to keep going. And so for all of them, I think they were looking around and saying, if all it could do 10 years ago was add, subtract, multiply, and divide, and now it can do so much more, where will it be next? And of course, all of the people around them in the media, in their R&D shops, kept comparing computers to brains. They used to talk about them as the giant electrical brains, right? And all of their metaphors were about brains. And so it's not such a leap to think, if it's already a brain and it already does things we can do, surely it will do all the rest.
Yeah. It's not a massive leap. Do you think, if you look at like that and you know, internet and other milestone moments where we've gone, wow, like, do you think we've always understood the consequences of the changes that are happening, or did the consequences come afterwards?
Yeah, look, I think it's sort of, they're interesting moments, right? Because there's also I mean, you and I have lived through some of it, right? There's this bit where the technology changes and then an application gets built on top of it, and then the technology changes again and an application gets built on top of it, right? So think, you know, the internet to the web, you know, to search engines, transformer architecture, Gen AI. There's kind of, there tends to be a sort of a 10 to 20 year cycle of those things happening. Look, do I think they understood the consequences? I know we talk a lot about unintended consequences, and I'm less inclined to think that holds water, because the consequences have been clear all along. And the reason I can say that about the AI space kind of in some ways bridges us into part 3 of this conversation about what is a blueprint for the future, right? And so if you say, what are the lessons from the past? The lessons I think you always have to ask yourself that are useful for the place you stand in is, where does the technology or the thing I am thinking about come from? Who was at the table when it was built? Who wasn't at the table? What was the problem they were trying to solve? And what might they have built as a result into this technology or into this system that appears to be inevitable, but was actually a set of choices?
Okay, so if we've got, let's just play that out. If we've got the wrong people at the table, or we've not got the right level of diversity, they make assumptions because their life is their lived experience and everyone lives it this way. That gets loaded in, which gives the rest of us a quite bizarre experience.
Yeah, and sometimes because it's so obvious, you don't even think about putting it in the FAQs. So it's sort of a little bit about, and I'm not even sure it's about the right or the wrong people at the table. It's about knowing who was there. And then what's the lesson for today, right, is inevitably the who is around the table will frame what you are doing. So thinking about who's there and who isn't there, and about why you are making those choices, really important. Being really clear about what is the problem statement that you are tackling, and asking yourself, is that the right problem statement?
What do you
if
think our
one of
problem
the
statement should be right now? What are the things we should be trying to solve?
Well, look, if I roll the clock back even further and I go back to thinking about James Watt tidying up the steam engine to make it, scalable and to get his first patents. I think if someone had said to him, "Oi, Jimmy boy, this thing you're making now, it's going to go to scale. It's going to eat the trees of the planet. It's going to belch smoke and give us a 100-year pollution problem. Could you change a little bit about that system so
Yeah,
that it generates a different set of byproducts?" And he had a mind to do that, we
yeah,
would be in a different place now. So I look at it and I think about, where are the places that we should be asking the question? And you can see it surfacing already, I would say, Dom, in the last maybe 18 months, as
mm,
many of the companies you and I know well, are starting to stare into the face of both the extractive nature of the rare earth minerals in their supply chains, the nature
yeah,
of their supply chains, and I think the energy footprints of
yeah,
their various technologies. So as people start to work out, how do we run our server farms down to closer to a net zero? How do
mm,
we think about more sustainable methods of both producing and recycling technology? How do we think about the energy footprint of these server farms? How do we reconfigure our workload so that they're less energy intensive? I think that conversation feels hugely important and often
yeah.
doesn't surfaced in the conversation about ethics about AI. But for me, the
Yes,
sustainability bit is absolutely part of the ethical
100%.
conversation.
Yeah, should be, yeah, because the two are featured in the same conversation, right? If you're using more energy to generate efficiencies, are you more efficient? Is a great sort of round loop. If we stay with that at the macro level, but then at the micro level, I've heard you. We've talked before about this, and I've heard you talk about it in other areas, like the future not being evenly distributed, right? In a world of let's just pretend AI is one thing because it's easier for me to think about. It, how do we make sure everyone comes along for the ride, or are we making sure everyone comes along for the ride from a societal standpoint? Is it that some people are going to be impacted and completely left and we'll just ignore them, and the people that benefit are so loud that we're like, everything was fine?
Yeah, I think there's a different conversation there too, Tom, right, that runs in parallel to it, which is that AI is also being produced by corporations, and
Yes.
corporations have business models and logic and shareholders and
Okay.
a whole series of other constraints that force decisions, right? And so in all of our conversations about technology, it's really easy to talk about them as though they were slightly abstract ideas, as
Yes.
opposed to things produced by an organization to get a certain piece of work done. And one of the really interesting features of this current technological moment is that some of the underlying systems you need to build on are large, complicated, and expensive.
Yeah.
And we are in a moment in time when, in many places, it's quite hard to build these systems without having access to that. And so, and that is sort of sits inside the purview of, in many places, companies, not governments or national labs and research centers. And so there's an interesting tension for me, even as we ask the question about, is everyone in or is everyone out, is about, and it would be back to me about who's around the table and what is their
Yeah.
motivation and why are they doing things, right? Which is what we'd always sort of teach our students to ask too, right? Is not only what
Yeah.
is the problem, not only what is the problem that is being solved, but who's getting to decide that's the problem in the first place.
So if we flip that, if we imagine that table's there's a host of government, business, right, educational, whatever, all the right people are there, and we've decided as a society to put you at the head of the table,
Oh,
and
good
you're
grief.
allowed to share a couple of principles, right? To say, hey, please, when you're going through this next 20-year cycle, these are the principles I need you to apply. What are those? Because I imagine that they're the same principles that me and you need every business leader to be thinking of right now.
Look, here's an odd one for that conversation that we've just had. I think if you put me at the head of the table in this frame, the first thing I'm going to say to you is technology doesn't solve everything.
Okay.
So when people say, I'm just going to add AI to this, I think to myself sometimes, I think your problem might be your org chart.
Yeah. You might be able to do things faster. Because I always say, like, a fool with a tool's still a fool. You just made them faster. I see a lot of very fast idiots in my world, and as technology's got faster, the idiots just got faster, right? Unless you change the coefficient of more smarts, then
or you say, because I'm old enough to remember the point when people decided that e-government meant putting government forms online, but what it actually meant was putting government forms online first as PDFs, then as web pages that just copied the pages out of the form and increasingly just turned the form into smaller and smaller web pages. And at no point did someone say, gosh, that form made really good sense when it wasn't connected to anything, when it couldn't pull data from the previous thing. Like, there's this whole, and so there is a little bit about, as people have imagined and talked and given PowerPoint presentations about how AI would turn up and make things work better. The first piece of the actual work that needs to happen is this process that we are proposing to automate actually purpose fit for the world that we now find ourselves in? Is this task that we've always done actually a task we should keep doing? Or should we say, look, that task is tied up with a whole lot of things that a form needed back in 1970, and we can just bypass it now? And so I think the first thing I would probably say is AI is not the solution. Let's go work out what your actual thing you were trying to get done is, and let's be really clear about it.
There's a subtle thing you just said in there I want to call out, which was subtraction. It was the removal of old things before you add in a new thing, which I think is often forgotten. It's we add in the new thing, or we sprinkle in the new thing, and all it does is automate the old thing that we don't need anymore. But I think if we could all take some time out, pause, and go, what are the things that used to work in my business that I can now remove because they're not relevant for my customers or industry or environment right now? We'd actually have leaner organizations to start with that you could then layer in technology on top of.
Of course, you then end up having to work through the inevitable, but I love that thing, or I invented that.
It's comfortable.
Or that's my thing.
Yeah. I invented that 20 years ago. It's staying.
That's my line of code. It made me, I'm special because of it.
Yeah.
So I think, number one at the table, it's the AI is not the solution to every problem. Let's make sure we actually understand what our problem statements are. I think there is a bit of being really clear, because in some ways, you and I also know people use AI as shorthand for automation, as shorthand for various kinds of simplification of business processes, as shorthand for various kinds of, augmentation. I think being really clear, if it is about automation, what are you automating, and does that make the most sense? And how do you manage, because I'm sure also see this, right? How do you manage what needs to happen on a business back end versus what needs to be on the front end that is either facing your customers, your clients, your other businesses? And they're never as straightforward as they look.
No.
And so I think that second part of the puzzle is, do you actually genuinely understand your own processes? Have you thought about them recently and what work they are doing for you? Do you understand, your own data sets and what logic is embodied in them? And, if you use that data as a training set, are there things that data does, because that's the way you've always done it, that will limit the horizons of this new technology? So that will be the kind of the e-form problem, basically.
Yeah. So before we wrap, Genevieve, you said at the start, right? Hope. You talked about hope. In 60 seconds or less, share with our audience what can they go and do, read, play with, or whatever to give themselves the same hope, or at least some of the hope that you've got. Because I sensed, pronounced positivity in you, and yet in the market, I'm not feeling that. So if you could share, where can we direct people?
Look, I think you actually direct yourself to yourself. I know that sounds funny, but I tend to think that leaders have two responsibilities, right? One responsibility is to constantly be telling stories about the future. And we all do that, right? In all the ways we stand up, whether we're standing up and saying, this is what we're going to deliver to the market, these are our revenue targets, this is, the state we hope people will left when they've encountered us. We're always telling stories that are hopeful, right? Always telling stories about the future. I think for me, we need to be really mindful about the character of the stories we tell as leaders about the future. So how are we telling stories about the future where the future is more fair, more just, more equitable, more sustainable, and frankly, more hopeful? So how do we shape our language and our activities to constantly be doing that? And, because that is never sufficient, what are we doing actively to disrupt the present?
Right.
So that those stories, the now, so that those aren't just stories, but things that actually happen. So tell stories about the future, because that is in fact one of the roles of leaders. But
paint the picture, but take an action today.
Yeah. But what are the things you are doing right now in any given moment that ensure that there is a possibility of a hopeful future?
Yeah, I love that. That is a great way to end. Genevieve, I've learned a huge amount from every time I've interacted with you, and I'm sure our audience will as well, and they'll share the feedback. As a thank you for your time, we are donating $500 to. Do you want to tell us who we're donating it to?
You are donating it to the ANU Fund, which is a new fund we've started at the Australian National University to support our students' lives and ensure equity of access and aspiration.
I mean, education could not be more important than it is right now. So a massive thank you, Genevieve, to you for your time today, to your charity for accepting that donation. And hopefully our audience got something from that. I know I did. And let us know what you thought both of Genevieve's conversation and how you go about building hope. And tune in for the next Experts Unleashed. Thank you very much.